On July 16, 1996, a warm summer morning in Nutley, New Jersey, Susan Walsh walked out her apartment, leaving behind her young son, her notebook, and her typewriter, as if she expected to return in only a matter of minutes. She said she was stepping outside to make a phone call. She never came back. Hours stretched into days, and days stretched into weeks. A woman who had been alive with energy, driven by an insatiable hunger to write, to expose secrets, to live fully in the dangerous world she often reported on, had vanished without a trace. To many, Susan's disappearance was not random. She was a woman living at the intersection of worlds. On the surface, she was a mother, a daughter, and a freelance journalist chasing stories for publications like The Village Voice. But beneath the surface, her work often led her into dark places. Strip clubs, trafficking rings, and whispered networks of Russian organized crime that stretched from the streets of New York into international territory. Some would later insist that Susan made enemies among the most dangerous people imaginable. Others argued she had wandered too deep into subcultures she both studied and, at times, lived in herself. Her story became a chilling riddle. Was she silenced because of what she knew? Was she targeted because of what she dared to expose? Or was her vanishing the tragic consequence, a more personal struggle, a battle with addiction, exhaustion, and the thin line between the world of journalism and the world of survival? Susan Walsh's name would appear in headlines, but the trail of her case would grow colder and colder with every passing year. No body was ever found. No one was ever charged. And still today, her absence echoes like a ghost, a void left in the lives of those who loved her, and a haunting reminder of how one woman's courage to seek the truth may have cost her everything. To understand the disappearance of Susan Walsh, you first have to understand who she was. A woman caught between two worlds, driven by equal parts necessity and passion, and ultimately consumed by the same forces she tried to document. Susan was born in 1960 in New Jersey, and from an early age she showed what those close to her called a fiery streak. A young woman who could walk into a room and fill it with her wit, her ambition, and her sometimes chaotic energy. She was sharp, articulate, and creative. But more than that, she was restless. She was never the type to settle quietly into the ordinary path of suburban life. By her 20s, Susan's life had already begun to weave in and out of contradictions. On the one hand, she was a student of English literature, deeply immersed in books, poetry, and writing. On the other, she was a woman struggling with real-world pressures, money, survival, the demand to raise a son while also chasing her own artistic ambitions. To make ends meet, Susan turned to the strip club industry, working as an exotic dancer. For Susan, this was not simply a means of income, but also a world she observed closely with the eyes of a journalist. She was both participant and investigator, living inside the world she would later expose in her writing. It was through this dual existence that Susan began to carve her identity as a freelance journalist. She pitched and published pieces that drew back the curtain on New York's nightlife, the lives of strippers, and the underbelly of industries most people preferred not to see. She wasn't afraid to immerse herself in the darker side of the city. In fact, she seemed almost compelled by it. She wanted to understand it, to name it, to write it down. By the 1990s, Susan began writing for outlets like The Village Voice, where her reporting gained attention for raw honesty and its insider's view of hidden worlds. She wrote not as a detached observer, but as someone who knew the terrain intimately. She exposed the connections between strip clubs, organized crime, and the exploitation of women. She tracked how money and power flowed into the sex industry, and how many women, like herself at one time, were caught in the push and pull between survival and independence. Those who knew her described her as intense, sometimes erratic, but always fiercely intelligent. She was the kind of journalist who was willing to burn every bridge if it meant uncovering the truth. Yet that same drive also meant she was vulnerable. She crossed paths with powerful, dangerous people. She dealt with sources and subjects who operated outside the law. And in doing so, she blurred the line between reporter and participant. By the mid-1990s, Susan's ambitions expanded. She wasn't content to stop at strip clubs. She began following rumors of trafficking networks tied to Russian Mafia, whispers of international crime syndicates operating in New York. She also became intrigued by New York's so-called vampire subculture, a shadowy community that blurred performance art, role-play, and darker rumors of violence. To Susan, these worlds were not only stories. They were clues to a larger tapestry of human behavior. But stepping into them meant stepping into danger. Even as she gained recognition, Susan struggled personally. Friends later recalled that she battled periods of substance abuse, that her mental health could be fragile, and that she often shouldered the weight of raising her son alone. She lived a life on the edge, trying to balance motherhood, financial survival, and a relentless pursuit of her journalistic calling. By the summer of 1996, Susan Walsh was at crossroads. She had already published major pieces. She had tasted the thrill of journalistic recognition. But she had also made enemies, and she had exposed secrets that others may have wanted kept hidden. She had lived too close to danger for too long. And on July 16th, when she stepped out of her apartment and vanished, it was as though all of those contradictions, mother, dancer, journalist, survivor, investigator, collided into a single, devastating mystery. By the mid-1990s, Susan Walsh was no longer just writing about strip clubs. Her curiosity had grown darker, sharper, and more dangerous. She had started probing into worlds most reporters either ignored or outright feared. And it was these worlds, with their shadowy figures and unspoken rules, that many now believe may have led to her disappearance. One of Susan's most significant threads of reporting focused on the Russian Mafia's growing presence in New York City. In the chaotic years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian organized crime had spilled across borders, embedding itself in the fabric of America's underworld. Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, known as Little Odessa, became a hub of activity. Drugs, weapons, trafficking, and money laundering all passed to the hands of men with reputations for ruthless efficiency and brutal enforcement. Susan, always drawn to the edges of society, wanted to expose what was happening. She followed leads that connected strip clubs and sex work in New York to international networks, where women were trafficked and exploited under the guise of entertainment. She wrote with rare boldness, describing how the Russian Mafia had wormed its way into the city's nightlife, using clubs not only as businesses but as fronts for something larger. Her reporting didn't sit well with everyone. Friends recalled that Susan confided in them about threats, subtle but unsettling, that came after her pieces were published. She sometimes hinted that she knew too much, that she had dug too deep into worlds that didn't forgive curiosity. But if organized crime posed one danger, another came from an entirely different corner: New York's so-called vampire subculture. In the mid-90s, the city harbored a loosely connected community of people who identified with vampire mythology. For some, it was harmless, performance, nightlife, fashion, a sense of belonging. For others, it carried a darker undercurrent. There were whispered stories of individuals who blurred fantasy with obsession, engaging in blood-drinking rituals or violent roleplay. Susan, ever curious, began interviewing members of this underground. She wrote about their gatherings, their philosophies, and the line between subculture and something far more unsettling. To outsiders, her stories seemed sensational. But to those inside the community, they were intrusive, a betrayal of their secrecy. Rumors later swirled that Susan had been warned to stop digging, that her presence at certain events had made her unwelcome, and that her disappearance might have been the ultimate act of silencing. So by the summer of 1996, Susan Walsh stood at a crossroads of danger. On one side, the Russian Mafia and human trafficking networks she was attempting to expose. On the other, a shadowy underground subculture that thrived on secrecy and myth. Both worlds shared one trait: they didn't appreciate outsiders shining a light where darkness was preferred. And in the middle of it all, Susan was still a mother, still a woman raising a young son alone. Friends later said she was stressed, exhausted, but determined. She believed in her work. She believed these stories mattered. But she may not have realized just how high the stakes had become. It was in this atmosphere, a swirl of danger, ambition, and secrecy, that Susan stepped out of her New Jersey apartment on July 16, 1996, telling no one exactly where she was going. She said she needed to make a phone call. She never came back. July 16, 1996, began like any other humid New Jersey summer day. Susan Walsh, 36 years old, left her Clifton apartment sometime in the late morning. She lived in a small unit, modest but filled with books, notes, and reminders of her double life. The grounded, practical mother of a young boy and the restless, ambitious journalist chasing stories most people wouldn't dare touch. That morning, neighbors would later say they saw her briefly. She didn't seem distressed, but there was a hurriedness about her. Some accounts suggest she told her father she needed to use a payphone, a detail that would become haunting later. In the mid-90s, cell phones weren't yet universal. For someone on a tight budget like Susan, payphones were still the quickest way to reach people. Around 12 o'clock noon, Susan left her apartment building. No one knows who she intended to call. She carried no bag with her, no sign she planned to be gone long. Her son remained at home, waiting for her return. And then nothing. Hours passed. The ordinary rhythm of the day turned strange as Susan didn't come back. For someone so deeply tied to her son, her absence was immediately alarming. By evening, when she still hadn't returned, her friends and family began to worry. And by the next day, panic set in. Her father reported her missing to Clifton police. Officers quickly canvassed the neighborhood. They checked local payphones. They asked neighbors. But Susan was gone. Her car, a white Ford Escort, remained untouched outside her apartment. Her wallet, ID, and keys were still inside her home. Everything suggested she had only meant to step out for a few minutes. That made the silence even more chilling. No signs of struggle were found around the apartment complex. No one recalled hearing anything unusual. It was as though Susan Walsh had simply walked out her door and vanished into thin air. But investigators knew people don't just disappear without reason. They began looking into her work. The Russian Mafia stories, the vampire community, the strip club exposés. They also looked into her personal life, the custody struggles over her son, her finances, her romantic entanglements. Each avenue opened new possibilities, but none led to her. And as the days turned into weeks, one fact remained painfully clear. Susan's son was left waiting for a mother who never came home. The day Susan disappeared was unremarkable in its ordinariness, and maybe that's what made it so frightening. It wasn't a trip overseas. It wasn't a risky late-night investigation. It was simply a woman walking out of her apartment in the middle of the day in a quiet New Jersey neighborhood never to be seen again. When Susan Walsh was first reported missing, police in Clifton treated it as they often do with adult disappearances. At 36 years old, she had the right to leave her life behind if she wanted to. But her father, her friends, and most of all her son insisted. Susan would never just walk away. Not without telling someone. Not without her child. Detectives quickly realized this was no ordinary missing persons case. They entered her apartment. Nothing was out of place. Her wallet, her keys, her identification, all were left behind. The only thing missing was Susan herself. The car in the parking lot was checked. No evidence of tampering. No sign she'd packed for travel. If she had left voluntarily, she'd left with nothing. Within days, Susan's background as a journalist began steering the investigation in darker directions. She'd written about strip clubs, about organized crime, about the Russian Mafia's grip on New Jersey. In one chilling article, she had named names, people she believed were connected to trafficking and violence. Could one of them have retaliated? Detectives began questioning employees at local clubs she had covered. Some admitted they knew Susan. Some said she'd been pushing too far. There were whispers she was making enemies. But no one would go on record, and fear hung heavy in the air. Then came another angle. Susan had been researching New York's underground vampire community, a subculture filled with eccentric personalities, but also, according to rumors, people who embraced criminality. A few acquaintances claimed she was fascinated, maybe even a little too involved. Police interviewed figures from that world, but nothing substantial emerged. Meanwhile, her family pressed investigators not to dismiss the simplest truth, that Susan had been attacked while stepping out to make a phone call. One neighbor recalled seeing her leave the building around noon on July 16th. After that, no confirmed sightings. The FBI was contacted, but jurisdiction remained tricky. Susan's disappearance fell within local law enforcement's hands. though her ties to organized crime raised alarms at the federal level. Still, no federal case was opened. Weeks dragged on. Flyers were printed. Media outlets covered the mystery. Journalist vanishes in broad daylight. One headline read, and yet, with every passing day, hope grew dimmer. Friends rallied around her son. They called her disappearance a tragedy not just for her family, but for the story she left unfinished. Susan had been digging into things that powerful people wanted buried. And so the investigation split down multiple paths, one leading to organized crime, one to fringe communities, one to personal struggles. Detectives knew one thing. Wherever Susan Walsh had gone, it was not by choice. When investigators retraced Susan Walsh's work, one trail stood out above all others: the Russian Mafia. In the mid-1990s, New Jersey and New York were seeing an influx of organized crime groups tied to former Soviet states. Extortion, prostitution rings, and drug trafficking spread quietly through nightclubs, strip clubs, and immigrant neighborhoods. Susan, freelancing for publications in desperate need of gritty investigative journalism, had walked straight into that world. Her reporting pulled no punches. She wrote about dancers being controlled by violent men, about women who had their passports taken away, trapped in a cycle of debt and exploitation, about names, actual names, of individuals tied to these operations. For many journalists, exposing the mafia meant keeping a cautious distance. But Susan had none. She was broke, hustling to raise her son, and willing to take risks to make her work stand out. That tenacity made her writing powerful, but it also made her dangerous enemies. One editor later recalled how she seemed nervous in the weeks before she vanished. She worried she was being followed. She had confided in friends that people she was writing about didn't like the attention. When police questioned club owners and bouncers connected to the establishments Susan had written about, responses were evasive. Some denied even knowing her. Others gave short, carefully measured answers. Detectives could feel the wall of silence, the same fear that often surrounds organized crime cases. The mafia theory gained traction for one simple reason. Retaliation was not uncommon. Reporters, informants, even casual acquaintances who got too close. Sometimes they disappeared. And Susan, unlike many others, had no protective institution around her. She wasn't working for a big newspaper with legal teams and security. She was a freelancer, largely on her own. Yet, despite all of this, no solid evidence ever tied the Russian Mafia directly to her disappearance. There was no eyewitness, no trace of her body, no intercepted communications, nothing concrete, just a chilling possibility that a mother trying to make a living as a writer had stepped too close to a dangerous truth. For Susan's family, the thought that organized criminals silenced her was unbearable. But for investigators, it remained one of the most plausible explanations. If the mafia theory represented the cold, calculated world of organized crime, the next possibility felt like something out of a Gothic novel: the vampire underground. In the 1990s, New York City had a hidden nightlife scene unlike any other. Clubs and gatherings where people identified as real vampires. They didn't just wear fangs and costumes for Halloween. They lived a lifestyle, some claiming they drank blood consensually, others immersed in rituals that blurred the line between theater and belief. Susan Walsh was one of the first journalists to write about the subculture. She wasn't mocking it. She wasn't sensationalizing it. Instead, she documented it with the same raw, unflinching style she used on strip clubs and trafficking. And in doing so, she gained unusual access. She knew the names. She visited the clubs. She interviewed self-proclaimed vampires about why they lived this way. To outsiders, it was just bizarre nightlife. But for those inside the community, Susan had stepped into something intimate, secretive, and, at times, hostile to outsiders. Some within that world didn't want attention. They feared exposure. They feared being branded as freaks, or worse, dangerous criminals. For them, Susan's articles weren't just stories. They were a threat to their anonymity. Rumors swirled in the months after she vanished, that she had been taken by members of the vampire community, that she had gotten too close to individuals who didn't want their names published. Some even claimed Susan had fallen under the influence of certain figures in the scene. But here's the unsettling truth. None of this could be proven. Detectives looked into the theory, but they found no evidence that anyone in the vampire subculture had harmed her. Forensic leads went nowhere. Witness accounts contradicted one another. Still, the vampire angle stuck in the public imagination. It was eerie. It was strange. And it symbolized Susan's boldness as a writer, her willingness to step into shadows few dared explore. For investigators, though, the vampire theory was a distraction. Fascinating, yes. Tabloid-friendly, yes. But with no evidence, it remained just that, a theory. And yet, when combined with the mafia angle, it painted a portrait of Susan's life in those final months. She was circling worlds of secrecy, danger, and taboo. Whether it was criminals with money to protect or fringe communities terrified of exposure, she was writing about people who had powerful reasons not to be in the spotlight. And then she disappeared. From the moment Susan Walsh vanished, the investigation was hamstrung by a simple but brutal fact. There was almost no physical evidence. No body, no weapon, no signs of a struggle. Just the last confirmed sighting of her leaving her New Jersey apartment to make a phone call. Her estranged husband, Mark, was interviewed early on. He was cooperative, but his relationship with Susan had been strained for years. Friends described him as supportive of her writing, but often frustrated by her erratic schedule and the toll her career had taken on her. Still, detectives found nothing to implicate him. He had an alibi, and no evidence tied him to her disappearance. Attention then turned to Susan's lifestyle. She wasn't just a journalist. She was also a dancer, a mother, and someone who sometimes pushed herself to dangerous extremes. People whispered about her exhaustion, about her occasional use of substances to stay awake during marathon writing sessions, and about her desperation for the next story that would land her a bigger byline. Detectives wondered, had she simply walked away, overwhelmed by the chaos of her life? But Susan's closest friends rejected that theory outright. She adored her son, David. She wouldn't just abandon him. And despite her struggles, she was determined to make her career work. Walking away didn't fit the woman they knew. The investigation then circled back to her reporting. Detectives tried to trace her contacts in the Russian community, looking for any link between her articles on trafficking and her disappearance. But the trail was thin. Those who might have known more refused to talk. Fear hung in the air. The Russian Mafia had a reputation for silencing people. And if Susan had rattled their cage, no one was eager to risk the same fate. The vampire underground angle was also explored. Police spoke with members of the subculture who had interacted with Susan. Most denied any animosity toward her, insisting that her coverage had been relatively fair. But others were less cooperative, dismissing the police inquiries as harassment. Ultimately, detectives found nothing tangible, no threats, no messages, no violent altercations. By the end of 1996, the case was already going cold. Leads dried up. Susan's credit cards and bank accounts showed no activity. Her car hadn't moved. It was as if she had simply been erased. The FBI got involved briefly, offering their expertise in missing persons cases. But without evidence of federal crime, their role was limited. They, too, came away empty-handed. For Susan's family, the lack of answers was torture. Her father, constantly calling detectives for updates, felt his daughter's case wasn't being taken seriously enough. Her friends, many of them fellow writers and dancers, launched their own search efforts, plastering posters and organizing vigils. Yet every promising lead ended in the same place. Nowhere. The tragedy deepened with the passage of time. Months became years, and Susan's name slipped further from headlines. Other stories captured the public's attention, and Susan's case was quietly filed away as unsolved. But for those who loved her, it was never forgotten. And the questions lingered. Did Susan stumble into something she wasn't supposed to see? Did she meet someone that night who silenced her? Or did the weight of her chaotic life finally push her into the shadows willingly, leaving behind the people who cared about her most? When a disappearance leaves behind almost no evidence, theories rush in to fill the void. In Susan Walsh's case, they multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. The first and perhaps most chilling theory was that Susan had crossed the wrong people in her journalism. Her articles on sex trafficking and exploitation in the Russian community were bold, unflinching, and far ahead of their time. In the mid-1990s, few journalists were willing to expose such a dangerous world. Susan did, and that bravery might have come at a devastating cost. Some believe she was targeted by organized crime figures, silenced to stop her from publishing more stories. There were whispers that she had been warned before, hints from sources that her reporting was making enemies. If true, her disappearance could have been a deliberate act meant as a message to others. Don't dig too deep. But this theory, while plausible, lacked hard evidence. There were no threats in writing, no witnesses to an abduction, no recovered remains. It was as if the Mafia angle existed mostly in the shadows, impossible to confirm but impossible to dismiss. Then came the second theory. Susan had become too deeply entangled in the very underground she was reporting on, the so-called vampire subculture of New York. Some said she'd been accepted into the community. Others said she was seen as an outsider, an intruder documenting rituals that weren't meant for public consumption. Could resentment have boiled over into violence? Could her pursuit of authenticity and her reporting have placed her in the crosshairs of people who preferred secrecy above all else? Again, police found no proof. No one from the subculture ever came forward with accusations of violence. But the mystery and exoticism of the vampire angle ensured it would dominate headlines for years, cementing itself as part of Susan's legacy. The third theory was more personal. Some suggested that Susan's disappearance might not have been the work of shadowy enemies at all, but instead the result of her own struggles. Friends acknowledged that Susan's life was difficult. She balanced single motherhood with financial instability, exhausting jobs, and the endless grind of freelancing. She sometimes leaned on substances to keep up with her workload. Was it possible she'd suffered a breakdown, wandered away, or chosen to start fresh somewhere far from the pressures of her life? Her loved ones rejected this outright. They insisted she would never leave her son, David. He was her anchor, her reason for fighting through sleepless nights and endless deadlines. To imagine Susan voluntarily abandoning him was unthinkable. A fourth, darker possibility emerged years later. The idea that Susan may have been another victim of an unidentified predator. In the mid-1990s, New York and New Jersey had their share of violent offenders, men who targeted women on the margins of society, especially dancers and sex workers. Could Susan have crossed paths with one of them? Could her disappearance have been random, a cruel twist of fate, rather than a targeted attack? Police explored these angles, but never tied Susan's case to any known offender. Each theory carries weight. Each offers fragments of possibility, but none have ever been proven. And so, nearly 3 decades later, Susan Walsh exists as both a cautionary tale and a haunting mystery, a journalist who lived on the edge of danger and who may have paid the ultimate price for pursuing the truth. Nearly 3 decades have passed since Susan Walsh walked out of her New Jersey apartment and vanished into history, and yet her story refuses to fade. In many ways, the silence of her case, the absence of answers, the lack of resolution, has become its own kind of echo, one that continues to reverberate in journalism circles, in the hearts of her loved ones, and in the broader fight for women who disappear without justice. For journalists, Susan's story is a stark reminder of the risks that come with chasing the truth. Freelancers especially live on the edge. Without protection of a major news organization, they must navigate dangerous worlds alone. Susan was a single mother, self-employed, without the safety nets that established investigative reporters sometimes have. She proved that bravery doesn't always come with backing, that some of the most daring work happens in the shadows of the newsroom. Colleagues remember her determination. Even when paychecks were late, even when editors turned her away, Susan never stopped digging. She believed journalism could shine a light in the darkest corners, and she refused to look away from stories that others ignored. In that sense, she left behind a kind of blueprint: courage, resilience, and a willingness to risk personal safety in service of truth. For her son, David, the loss was immeasurable. He was just 12 years old when his mother disappeared. Overnight, he was forced into a life without answers, a life shaped by questions that would never fully be resolved. Those who knew Susan say she adored him, that every late night at her typewriter and every long shift at the clubs was for him. And so his grief was not only for her absence, but for the stolen future they should have shared together. In law enforcement and advocacy circles, Susan's case remains a painful example of how quickly momentum can fade. After the initial wave of media attention, her story was eclipsed by newer tragedies, fresher headlines. Without leads, the investigation grew cold. Detectives moved on. Files were boxed away. And like so many missing women, especially those who were mothers, dancers, or living precariously, Susan's case slipped into obscurity, but not completely. Her name resurfaces from time to time, in articles about cold cases, in discussions of missing journalists, and in forums where strangers keep her memory alive. The fact that we are still talking about her today is proof of something powerful, that stories like Susan's do not vanish, even when the people themselves are lost. They live on in collective memory, demanding recognition, begging for justice. Perhaps the most haunting part of Susan Walsh's legacy is the way it captures the duality of innocence and horror. On one hand, she was a devoted mother, a gifted writer, a woman chasing opportunity. On the other, she was swallowed by a darkness that may never be named. That contrast between the ordinary and the terrifying keeps her story alive in the public imagination. And so, we are left with questions. What truly happened on that hot July day in 1996? Did Susan stumble into the crosshairs of organized crime? Did she anger the wrong people in a secretive subculture? Did she fall victim to a predator? Or did her disappearance reveal something even larger about how society treats women who dare to move through dangerous spaces, unprotected and unafraid? Her legacy is not only the mystery she left behind, but also the demand that we keep looking for answers, for justice, for the truth that she, above all others, was always seeking. In the end, Susan Walsh's story closes not with answers, but with silence. Silence from investigators, silence from witnesses, silence from the passage of time. And yet, within that silence, her voice still lingers. It lingers in the work she left behind, in the son who still carries her memory, and in the journalists who followed in her footsteps, willing to risk everything to chase the truth. Her case is not simply about one missing woman. It is about how quickly society can let someone slip through the cracks. It is about how women who live on the margins, dancers, single mothers, freelance reporters, are too often dismissed, their lives devalued, their disappearances forgotten. And it is about the chilling reality that even in a city as vast and powerful as New York, a woman can walk out the door and vanish forever. What remains are fragments, a car left behind, a notebook filled with unfinished drafts, a child waiting at home, a trail of stories she exposed that may or may not have sealed her fate. Each piece whispers a possibility, but none fit neatly into a conclusion. The truth is fractured, like glass scattered on a dark street, reflecting back only glimpses of what might have happened. And so we are left with a haunting question. How do you tell a story without an ending? For nearly 3 decades, Susan Walsh has been frozen in time, her face on missing persons posters, her name invoked in whispers of conspiracy and tragedy. But the full story, the one she deserved, remains unwritten. Perhaps the verdict is this: Susan Walsh is not forgotten. Not by her son, not by the journalists who followed her path, not by the few who still speak her name in hopes of answers. Her story endures because it reminds us of the fragile line between truth and danger, between exposure and erasure, between the light a reporter tries to shine and the shadows that may consume them. As the screen fades, we are left with her absence, an absence louder than any resolution. Susan once wrote that the hardest part of journalism was finding the courage to tell stories no one wanted to hear. In her disappearance, she became one of those stories. And until the day someone steps forward with the truth, her case will remain a question mark, suspended in time.